I believe that the discussions you've been having and the routing around of the censorship industrial complex that you've been forced to engage in will go down in history as some of the most important information of our contemporary era. I think that you are engaged in what I like to call holy work. A lot of people who I associate with are like, oh, Bret Weinstein, like it's like the Dead Horse podcast. It's like COVID, COVID, COVID. And it's not. You talk about more. But I actually think that this is super important, that we don't let it go. And most people are, and you are not. And so I want to praise you for your bravery, your tenacity, your open-mindedness, and just your work, you and the whole team. So
thank you. That means a tremendous amount to me, and I really appreciate it. There are elements of what you say that I agree with. Let's take me out of the equation. I think it is vital that we understand what happened during COVID. And as I have said from the beginning, it wasn't about COVID. COVID revealed what was true of our system, having nothing to do with disease. And it revealed it across the board, such that if we could look at it and say, how did this happen, and actually get to an answer to that question, we would know what we had to do to fix it. So that's why I don't want to let it go.
Right. Well, and I don't want you to let it go, but let me bring this around to a very interesting convergence between rockets and COVID, or sort of. And that's the following. At NASA, when you have a mission failure, which does happen, fortunately not all that often, but we had the Apollo 1 fire and the Apollo 13 mishap and the Challenger explosion and the Columbia disintegration on reentry, and we've had a number of uncrewed missions that have also failed. The Hubble Space Telescope had issues when it was first deployed, and other things have not worked. Missions have failed, even if no humans were on board. When NASA has a mission failure, here's what they do. They convene a panel of experts who had nothing to do with the project. They empower that panel of experts to have access to all documentation and all personnel who worked on the project. And they instruct the personnel to be completely honest and transparent to the inquiries. And these mishap investigation boards, or failure investigation boards, or accident investigation boards, they work oftentimes for months or even a year. And you know what happens? They almost always figure out what went wrong and why it went wrong. And then they write up their reports, like the Challenger one with Richard Feynman is quite famous. They write up their findings. They don't it's not about blame. It's about figuring out what went wrong, documenting why it happened, and then making recommendations to make sure it never happens again. And so I always thought during COVID, when things started to obviously get weird and go off the rails, and it was obvious that huge mistakes had been made, I was like, why don't we convene a failure investigation board, or maybe several, because there's so many different aspects. Like, why did we get this wrong? Why did we get that wrong? What did we learn? What did we do? And I, for a long time, thought this was the obvious answer, and this is what a competent government agency would do. But it didn't really happen. Some individuals have tried to do it. RFK Jr. comes to mind with his book, Letter to Liberals. But, it's just one man. And now, unfortunately, I think, I'm not going to say it's too late, but maybe it's too late and too early at the same time. I think that the problem is you can't find people who have nothing to do with it to be on this committee because everybody's polarized one way or the other and their mind's made up,
No, I don't think that's why, actually. That may be a component. But I think when you consider what NASA is, the chances that somebody has an interest in mission failure are very low.
Right.
Your enemies might, but the chances that they're going to get into NASA and they're going to cause rockets to blow up that would otherwise succeed, that, I'm not saying it will never happen, but that has not been the answer to what has happened yet. And what that means is that although certainly, there have been embarrassing errors, we've had mission failures
because of unit conversion errors.
Yeah, imperial versus metric units. But aside from covering your ass when you've made an error, or you've made the call that the space shuttle will launch in spite of temperatures to which the O-rings aren't tolerant, as happened in the Challenger disaster. Right. So there is a cover your ass instinct, but there is not nobody sells out the public to hijack a NASA mission for other purposes. And therefore, the covering your ass is of a normal human scale.
Yeah, so, I don't want to bash on NASA, but I want to push back just a little bit. I basically agree with what you said, and I think you're right that that's a possibly substantial divergence between COVID mission failure and NASA mission failure. But look, there is a certain amount of capture even within NASA. Like there's companies that, are on the gravy train and they want to keep building these expensive systems. So like it shows up in less dramatic ways, but like maybe they're not interested in building more efficient systems, or, it's a standard kind of defense contractor mentality. SpaceX has disrupted that to some extent, but it's there. So, but it's it's an insidious but far less deadly form of capture than we saw, arguably, in COVID and in food and health in general.
Well, I also think that there's a question of how divergent the incentives are. It used to be that one expected pharma, for example, to push its profitable drugs and to drive out previous drugs that had lost their patent. You expected a certain amount of that. And you didn't necessarily expect them to push a drug that would actually harm patients. You just thought there was some sort of shell game about which prescription you were going to get. And you might get a drug that was 20% less effective because it was under patent. But you weren't expecting a toxin. And I believe this is, maybe I've just woken up to it, but I believe this has changed over time. And that now you actually have an industry, in the case of pharma, where what is demand called with respect to pharma products? Ill health. So you have an industry that wants demand, which means it wants ill health, and it has woken up to how to create that demand and then fill it with the supply of something that may or may not be efficacious by creating the impression that something is efficacious. But put that aside, in the NASA context, even if you've got a contractor who wants you to put something that they make on your rocket and it's less efficient than some competing thing that you might source that would be better for the mission,
right,
it's still not antagonistic to the mission. And so if it became antagonistic to the mission, then I think your argument about why NASA failures are frequently understood in their aftermath would fail. It would break down. But for the moment, as long as everybody has an interest in figuring out what went wrong so it doesn't happen next time, you can have a proper investigation. And the punchline to that is, in the case of COVID, you have people with the power to succeed actively obstructing our comprehension of what just happened.
YouTube's not like offering to reinstate you, and you're kind of, am I correct that you're still feeling?
Well, it's very interesting what's happened at YouTube, and the pattern again is absolutely conspicuous from my chair. Let me describe it to you. We went far enough that they felt that they could get away with demonetizing the channel, and I believe that their plan was to kick us off the platform. We had two channels. We had 400,000+ subscribers on each, a main channel and a clips channel. And frankly, we were making money in a way that was new to us. It lasted for 1 month. I did a live discussion with Pierre Corey about the ivermectin question. And then I did a live podcast with Steve Kirsch and Robert Malone.
I remember it very well.
And they pulled both of those things. They struck the channel. They set up the conditions to remove us. I believe they would have accepted it if we had self-censored. They would have backed off and they would have restored our ability to earn. That's, I think, what they wanted. But failing that, they were perfectly ready to throw us off. And then Joe Rogan, through what he declared an emergency podcast, he held an emergency podcast about the situation. And it resulted in YouTube backing off entirely. The channel remains. It is unmonetized. YouTube refuses to remonetize it. But conspicuously, the audience is completely static. It was absolutely skyrocketing before they demonetized us. And then it was going up, 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 plateau. And it's been at a plateau ever since. So what that tells me is that they are interfering, that they zeroed out more than half our family's income. But here's the other part of the pattern. We can say whatever we want. They don't strike the channel. So I think the point is,
you can say whatever you want, but do you think people are actively, like, how can I say this? Are they actively not able to access your videos, or is it just that for whatever reason, your subscriber count froze?
The beast decides who sees what. It decides what to suggest when. It decides who to unsubscribe. We don't know the full range, and it decides what to tell us about who's watching it. It could be that more people are seeing it than we know, but the numbers are artificially flat. It could be that it's being kept from people. It could be that there's a target number that are allowed to see it, people who have already been lost, whatever. So I don't know what the pattern is, but the idea that we derailed a plan to get rid of us by creating pain. Joe Rogan created pain. It wasn't worth it to Google to admit what they were doing, as they would have had to if they threw us off. And so they backed off their overt plan. They block our reach or our ability. The fact is, the number of subscribers to the channel dictates what it is that we can earn if we source an advertiser from outside of that ecosystem. The question is, well, how many people can you reach? So that number is directly interfering with our ability to earn.
It's interesting. The thing you described with YouTube is an example of scramble for the middle.
Yes. Well, it is an intermediate solution. I know because insiders at Google have told me that the decision about what to do with our channel, the decision not to remonetize it, was made in the C-suite, quite possibly by the CEO, but certainly in the C-suite. So it was a top-level concern. And I think the other thing that people perhaps don't quite understand is this is a big channel, but it's not a gigantic one. So when I say that we're being interfered with at this level, it sounds like a delusion of grandeur. On the other hand, if you think about what it is that actually happened to the COVID narrative, well, who showed up on DarkHorse and then went to Joe Rogan? Right? We had Pierre Corey, we had Robert Malone, we had Peter McCullough. So that was DarkHorse violated a sacred rule. You can't have two PhD biologists saying, actually, this is complex, but it's not as complex as you think it is. This is more comprehensible than you know. Let's unpack it. Let's talk about what the actual facts of the disease are, what the actual facts of the therapy are, what the evidence really suggests, where the evidence seems to be phony. So we did that. And we talked to people who had been targeted for dismissal. Pierre Corey is supposed to be
you on-ramped them onto Rogan, who couldn't be dismissed.
Right. Now, I don't want to underrate what Joe was doing. Yes, Joe was paying attention to DarkHorse, and he listened to the discussions with these folks. But Joe is an incredibly smart guy and very widely read, and he has an excellent bullshit detector. He knew that this story wasn't making sense, and he knew what sense sounded like. It sounds like Pierre Corey. It sounds like Robert Malone. And when you look into these people's backgrounds and you hear they're supposed to be quacks, and then it turns out, actually, these are top flight people in their fields with impeccable credentials. So I think the point was you can't. The role that DarkHorse played in this story was in its own way. Yeah, maybe on-ramp is the right descriptor.
It's a
but
yeah, right, sure.
it's a good one. But the point is, if we can do away with the on-ramp,
Yeah.
that solves a big problem. And I believe that they've decided to do away with the on-ramp. And, I'm not complaining about the quality of my life. I live wonderfully.
Uh-huh.
But the interference with our family's ability to earn, the interference with my ability to produce security for my children in light of a very dangerous world that's being made dangerous by the very people who are doing the interfering is absolutely maddening.
It's maddening. I agree. I find it maddening, and I'm not even, running any sort of media company or whatever we want to call it, media entrepreneur thing.
This tells me I should have gone into rocket science.
Oh, I don't know about that. I would, I'm not going to go into my personal battles over all this stuff. Let's just put it this way. I was within 1 day of being fired for being an unvaccinated person who worked at a U.S. company with over 100 employees. And then the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no. So, that's as much as I'll say about it. And to be fair, I can't blame my company for this. Like, this was the law, supposedly. Like, they had to fire me, and what are they going to do? Close the company? Like 1,000 people because like 3 or 4, contrarians? No, of course not. And so anyway, it didn't happen. Thank goodness for the Constitution.
Thank goodness for the Constitution, although among the many jaw-dropping facts of COVID are the number of people who could not find that constitutional protection, could not find protection under the Nuremberg Code.
Right. Healthcare workers. Right.
Healthcare workers, members of the military. And that, I get stopped fairly regularly by people, with literally 2 exceptions since Evergreen happened. What people say in person is always nice.
Oh, okay.
And something that I have been hearing a lot in the last year is, thank you. I did not get vaccinated because you and Heather were making so much sense on this topic, and it gave me the courage to resist. And every time I hear this, I feel this powerful sense of having done something right. The danger of the shots was so great that the idea that there are people walking around out there who don't have to worry about the damage that they did because we made sense to them. I don't know. I'm heartened by it.
That's why I said, and I think it's only just begun. When I say that history will in my estimation, remember you well, I don't mean the history of the next couple of years. What I mean is that once there are dispassionate, once this is like history and not present, and I know that's a loaded term because who knows what road we're headed down with the inevitability of future pandemics and all the other crises that are being promoted. But, eventually there'll be scholars who will be mining all this stuff. And, obscure videos on like former platforms that no longer exist is going to be like historical gold. And I think the truth will prevail.